array of speakers from across the progressive spectrum. We do hope that we will have some time at the end for some questions as well. For those of you that are technically minded and you're on the Twitter, as I believe it's called, if you want to tweet about this, the hashtag that we suggest that people use is hashtag YesPCS. There are also cards on the chairs, and if anyone would like more information about YesPCS or to join our group, please complete those. So without further ado, we'll go on to our first speaker this evening. Our first speaker this evening is that rare thing in politics, someone who isn't scared to do the right thing and to stick by it despite a hysterical media. He was first elected as an MSP for the Lothians in 1999, and he served the people of Edinburgh since 2007, and of course he's also been the Cabinet Secretary for Justice since that time. So our first speaker is Kenny MacAskill.
Can you all hear, or do you need me to use the mic? I've been minded by Maggie. There may be people that can't hear at the back, so I will use... That's it? That's it. They can? Well, we'll see how it goes if you need me to use the mic. Obviously, I've been doing a lot of meetings and, setting out why we believe Scotland can, should and must be an independent nation. I'm not going to bore you. Some of you will have heard them all before in their stock speech, but equally others, much more eloquent than me, will be commenting. I thought what I would do is seek to put the can, should and must argument into the perspective of where we are coming from as a government and as those who serve the government and work very hard as civil servants, which is what PCS do. And that's why I think, first of all, from CAN, is to put on record that we already have, as we do have in a national situation, the ability to be an independent nation, but we already have the apparatus for state. You have members who serve within the Scottish Prison Service, which is an outstanding service that I'm always proud and think gets undervalued because it's not what people know or recognise. Those who work with my own Justice Department, any faults are usually certainly mine, as opposed to those who are working for me and do an outstanding job. The same applies across the spectrum, whether in social work, whether in police, whether in fire brigade, whether in the Crown Office or property to fiscal. We have the opportunity there, we have all the apparatus of state, and indeed it certainly seems to me from discussing with many of you that it's a happier ship to be working within those organisations and within the Scottish Government and certainly within the UK departments, and indeed that's replicated, for example, in the Fire Brigade Union, where whatever challenges are faced, the FBU are out on strike, albeit there is industrial action being taken here, because I think there's a greater culture of respect, and indeed there's a recognition that a lot of the sins are out with our control, certainly in terms of the attack upon pensions, in terms of conditions. I see that in particular with the police, fire, and indeed with the Scottish Prison Service. I have to say, I don't know what I'll be doing at 67 or 68 if I'm spared or live that long. If I do, I'll outlive my father. But I have to say, I can't imagine seeking to be a prison officer on a landing in Barlinnie or even serving in Corton Vale. It is frankly ridiculous to expect individuals to serve in those occupations. There are jobs that are clearly constrained by age and capacity, and that applies across all those services. Police officers, because I was speaking to them just yesterday over coffee, have faced a substantial attack upon their pensions, increased contributions. The same applies to the fire brigade. That applies across the public sector. Let's be clear, the disaster in pensions occurred not in the public sector, where in the main they're fully funded because people have been chipping in. It's occurred in the private sector, like many people. When I worked in private practice, I was told to take out pensions for this and pensions for that, and a pension with your mortgage. And equally, probably quite clear, I've been better putting it in a sock at the end of my bed because of lots of people have been able to take commissions out of it, but it's certainly not had a lot of return. And yet what we're seeing is the price for the collapse of the private pension sector has been paid by the public sector, where people are expected to work longer, get less, and contribute more with something manifestly wrong. So to say, we have all the apparatus for state, we're capable of doing it, whether it's in taking over DWP, whether it's in taking over pensions, it's there and can be done. I believe we should, because there are whole areas of our society and I can look at it from my own portfolio, but we are constrained in what we can do in tax and pensions, as I've just been commenting on. We're limited in what we can do, most certainly in international affairs. We're limited in what we can do. It's been highlighted by the press as almost some great devolution of powers, the ability to bail out the bedroom tax. What we really need is the powers to revoke the bedroom tax, not to have a Scottish Government use funds that could be used elsewhere to mop up for a problem that's created by the south of England. But I think even from our own justice portfolio, I'm the Justice Secretary and I have to face challenges. What's the two biggest areas that affect serious organised crime? Firearms and drugs. What are reserved to the UK? Firearms and drugs. So already within the justice portfolio, there are huge areas over which you have no influence. Now they have, after pressure and request, devolved the power to licence air weapons. I welcome that, and we will do it because we do have particular problems here. But we are unable to take actions. There's something manifestly wrong. I pay more for my television licence than an individual who possesses a shotgun pays for their shotgun licence. And if you have a shotgun licence, you can have unlimited weaponry. We've seen that in the north of England, where people have possessed a licence and have had arsenals. Not simply number of firearms that they possess, but unlimited amount of ammunition that goes with it. There's something manifestly wrong there. And I'm not seeking to cause a press furore and argue for any change in the drug perspective and legislation at the moment, but let me say, and I do welcome the relationship we have with the Home Office, and we had a recent meeting on legal highs, but the palaver that we have to go through to take some action when there's a clear issue, it does eventually get taken in terms of legal highs when we have to seek to ban some of these chemicals that are actually meant for animal welfare, drugging horses or whatever, but are sold in head shops. We should be able to take immediate action if that is the advice that's coming to us from the Chief Medical Officer, coming from the police or whatever else. So there's those aspects there. But there's other areas. Health and safety is reserved. That's why when there's tragedies in the North Sea or there's industrial accidents, we do occasionally, no criticism in terms of what was dealt with at Stockline, we got the cooperation of HM government and we carried out an investigation. But we certainly haven't been able to do anything with regard to helicopters because the decision has been taken there is to be no investigation at the present moment. Now, I'm not saying we certainly would be rushing into any inquiry, but we don't have that right or opportunity. So when issues happen, whether in the North Sea, whether in industrial Glasgow, whether in offices or whatever, we're constrained in what we can do. Never mind, as I say, I've always said, as a Justice Secretary, I'm always minded of the great American folk artist Woody Guthrie, who in the Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde wrote that immortal line that, as through this world I've wandered, I've met some funny men. There's some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen. We've got the powers to be able to deal with those who produce the 6-gun. We might not be able to license it or control the legislation of it, but we aren't able to deal with corporate and commercial matters because they too are reserved. And we all know that there are aspects there. And I know senior police officers who would relish being given the opportunity, as Elliot Spritzer or others had in the United States, to actually start doing some digging as to where criminality took place. And if we are to be able to do these things, then we've got to address it. I was at the new Gartcosh campus. I've no doubt PCS members will be there. It's an outstanding institution. We do actually also have some space there for the security services. But I remember asking our own guys there who do covert serious organised crime and counter-terror, do we have the capacity and the ability to expand to deal with the security services? Absolutely. Now, we've made it quite clear in the white paper we'll keep security services separate from the police service. There are arguments over that. In Ireland, the Garda Síochána have a special branch to deal with security services. We always felt, and take the view that most modern Western European societies do, that it's better to actually keep your police as an organisation that isn't, and don't like to use the word tainted, but has different ethos and values in how you operate. But I certainly think that given we've got the space and capacity at Gartcosh, it would be much better for us to have our own security services to keep us safe from those who would perpetrate offences here, but not perhaps to seek to replicate some of the matters that have been ongoing from the United Kingdom government that we don't seek to emulate in any shape or form. And clearly the most important aspect is in external affairs. I was speaking to one of our young officials who had returned having been with the Scottish Government serving in Washington. I have no doubt that those who work within the Scottish Government are perfectly capable and much better in representing Scotland's interests abroad than those who are currently serving in UPREP or indeed in British embassies around the globe. They fail in many instances to stand up for Scottish interests. I was berated in a letter in the Herald recently, having pointed out what young Darren told me, because I was asking about what it was like around Washington, and he told me this wee story that actually there's 2 or 3 pictures in the British Embassy in Washington that are probably worth more than the real estate that the value of the British Embassy in Washington is. I'd only told this story that the woman was so irate about because she'd asked us about the cost of Scotland having representation abroad, and I simply said, well, I have no desire for any of those pictures on the walls, nor do we desire to emulate the site and location of the UK Embassy in Washington. What matters is that we should be represented ourselves to stand up, look after our own interests, both economic, social, as the Irish do, not simply to be a cheerleader, whether it was for George Bush or indeed now for President Obama. It's not where you're located, it's not the value of the real estate, the great artefacts that are on the walls, it's what you do with it. And that's why, as I say, I think from the point of view not simply of a government, but for those who serve in government, I look forward to those who serve in the Scottish Government having the opportunity to represent us, whether it's in the European Union, whether it's in the United Nations, whether it's in Washington or anywhere else. We will be better served by the skills and talents they have than those who are currently there with UPREP. Equally, I think we've also got to say that we must be an independent nation, because the UK government is pursuing austerity as a policy, not as a necessity to deal with a financial crash. They're dealing with privatisation, and that is going across the board. We are holding the dike in terms of that. Health is a clear area. But there are areas, and there comes a time when, if we don't have the powers of an independent nation, we will not be able to plug every hole that arises. There will be things that will come washing up and lapping over. The fire brigade are going out on strike south of the border. Why is it? Because there's a clear agenda, sooner rather than later, to mutualise the fire service south of the border. And we know that what will happen thereafter, once you've mutualised it, then sooner or later it will go to tender, and we'll see the privatisation of the fire service. That's why Matt Rack and others are out on strike south of the border. They know that there's no intention ever by any government in Scotland to do that, and that's why there is no strike here. Equally, in terms of police services, they roll back because of some of the difficulties that came out, but there is a clear intention to bring in privatisation. They've actually privatised, and it will affect probably some PCS and certainly Unison members. They've privatised forensic services, forensic science services south of the border, as I like to say, lock, stock and laboratory. It's all gone. Everything is out in the private sector. That is huge risk. It's actually quite beneficial to us in Scotland, because a lot of stuff from Northern Ireland that used to go to England because they had the capacity comes here, because you can't guarantee the same security once you go to a private sector or a university. They might do a very good job, and sometimes we have to utilise their services on very specialist things, but you can't guarantee the same security. But that's what they've done, privatised the whole lot. So it's not just forensic science, they're now looking at other aspects, what we would view as core aspects of policing. The prison service, they are looking to privatise. They've taken 2 prisons in the northeast of England, and they've just handed them over to the private sector. There's been a loss of something like 800 members of staff, and I meet with the POA. The POA Scotland are part of the POA. It's a hard furrow for the POA, and equally I know that PCS are represented in the Scottish Prison Service. That will never be done. As I was saying earlier, we do have private prisons in Scotland. They were signed off before I took office. We have to live with the consequences of Addywell and Kilmarnock. Addywell is up there as a scandal, almost not as bad as the Royal Infirmary, but almost. The cost of HM Prison Addywell over 25 years will be in the region of £940 million. Almost £1 billion. There's a guaranteed contract that increases it above inflation on an annual basis. The Chief Executive can give me no explanation. To be fair to him, it wasn't him that did it, but it rises at something like 2.5% above inflation on an annual basis. We're due to formally announce the opening. It's open and working HM Prison Grampian, and this gives you a perspective. The construction costs for HM Prison Grampian, the replacement for Peterhead in Aberdeen, are not 940 million, they're 80 million. That's what it costs to build a prison. Greenock will cost slightly less than that because it's smaller. Addywell will cost 940 million. We're currently doing the sums for what Peterhead, or Grampian rather, will cost over 25 years. I think the wages and the care maintenance won't be £840 million. They'll be significantly less. And that impacts upon you and your members. It's because of that we're not able to invest further in the prison estate. We're not able to put in wage products that we'd like to do. People pay the cost of that, and all of us as taxpayers pay. And equally, we're also seeing not just children's services, but south of the border, 60% of probation services have gone out to the private sector. Not done on a tactical basis, not done in terms of where they pursue it, just 60% arbitrarily out to the private sector. I don't believe that probation services are best dealt with by the private sector. I believe that they're best dealt with by public servants whose ethos will always be public safety, who will look after the interests of our community. That, as I say, is what probation services should be about. So it's for those reasons that I think we can, should and must. What we see for PCS, certainly within the justice portfolio, is but a microcosm of Scotland as a society. We can, because we have the ability, the talents, the resources, the institutions. We should rather, because we should make those choices and decide. And equally, we must, because if we don't, this is a choice of two futures. I've always concluded and said, it was at previous meetings with Colin, I'm older than many of you here in the audience, but we are facing a choice of two futures. Things are going in a different direction. I remember back in the 70s how my parents abhorred and detested Ted Heath. And then when Ted Heath was replaced by Margaret Thatcher, Ted Heath became almost the official opposition in Westminster because of the failure down there. He was viewed as some old buffer who liked to go sailing and who wasn't that bad. And when we had Thatcher, we looked back and thought, well, it wasn't as bad when we had Ted Heath. Then we got Cameron, and you look back at Thatcher and very few grieved at the time of the state funeral. But let's remember, Thatcher didn't bring in privatisation of the Royal Mail. She thought about it, but she backed off. But Cameron, no way. He's privatised the Royal Mail. What's the next step? I don't think it's likely to be Ed Miliband. It might be, but if it is, there's been no announcement from the Labour Party that they will roll back the privatisation of probation services. No announcement that they will roll back the privatisation of prison. No change across that privatisation agenda. The tragedy and the real fear is that the most likely alternative to David Cameron isn't Ed Miliband, it's probably Boris Johnson. And will there be a time, if we don't vote yes, that we'll look back and say, well, it wasn't as bad under Cameron. You should see what we've got now. They have an agenda. It's the Anglo-American model. I'm just back from visiting an old friend in the States. I took a train from New York to Washington. I went through Baltimore. If I hadn't known I was on that train, I would have thought I was going through Johannesburg or some suburb in South Africa. It was a shanty town and a ghetto, not a city in the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world. That's why we have to vote yes, and I'm grateful for your time and your support.